It's time for the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is the voice of the working class, Rick Smith. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So I got to tell you, looking at the media coverage of the fourth Trump indictment, the New York Times grabbed my attention because their headline page, it's kind of like you got like a third of the column with the headline being "Indictment is in over bid to flip vote in Georgia." It doesn't even mention really Trump. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know what it is. Oh, that's just, who knows. But you would then be focused to the more important story, which is a teen sentenced to life is making a case for release. That's the important story for democracy right there. It's curious why that. Curious, the New York Times, who's supposed to be so liberal, so far, so anti-Trump. Curious how that happens. Anyway, here to share some thoughts on, the media coverage of the what I'm calling the cycle. Trump is now hit for the cycle. He's got four separate indictments, and he wanted all four of them. But I've asked Craig Harrington to come talk with us. Craig is the research director at Media Matters, MediaMatters.org, the website. Craig, thanks for taking time for us.
Yeah, thank you for having me again.
So what do you make of this headline? I mean, am I reading too much into this? I mean, because I'm looking at this, I'm going, it just doesn't fit with everywhere else where big, bold, Trump indicted, or it seems a little soft.
Yeah, there are a couple of things at play here. And I think to be charitable to the New York Times, they probably are assuming that their readers know who is being indicted. He's kind of the most famous person in the world, and his now criminal saga has dominated the news for most of the past, more than a year. This really began with some New York Times and Washington Post reporting in February, I believe, of 2022. When the Mar-a-Lago documents scandal first bubbled up into the public's view. I imagine they think that their readers know who was indicted. But also you do have to think they try to be a little heterodox with their headline writers. They try to kind of make a point with them. I apologize for that noise. They try to make a point with their headlines and try to not follow the pack. But you also do have to understand, the New York Times, they really do take that liberal bias criticism to heart. Yeah. And it does affect the way that they cover the news. And their political desk is, frankly, very conservative, small c conservative, but very conservative in its coverage of major news and scandals, particularly those involving their very outspoken Republican opponents, because they just don't want to fight with them. They don't want to be seen as being, a liberal rag. And as a result, by attempting so studiously to avoid politicizing their news coverage, they accept the Republican framing often and end up politicizing it just toward the Republican preferences. And I'd be remiss if I didn't remind your listeners of how the New York Times has covered Trump, rigorously and authoritatively, but not with the vindictiveness that we saw their coverage of Hillary Clinton's, email protocol usage. And it's important to realize that as much attention as this Trump story has gotten, and it has gotten a dominating amount of attention, I think it's probably on par with, whether or not Hillary Clinton used her work email or her private email for work and vice versa, which was unimportant. In the grand scheme of things, 7 years hence, that was an unimportant thing that happened in American history, and it totally altered the course of human events and the trajectory of the 21st century because of how the New York Times covered that story.
You're absolutely right. But I look at this, and it's just soft.
Mm-hmm.
Indictment is in over bid to flip vote in Georgia. No, trying to overturn our democracy, trying to undo the sanctity of the ballot box. I mean, there could have been, I don't know, a little more sense of urgency, a little more sense of just how important this is, just how historic. No, it was a bid to flip the vote. That's all.
And, the responses that we saw from Republican statewide officials in Georgia, the response from Governor Kemp, the response from Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, they didn't cut any corners or pull any punches because they're defending the sanctity of their own work, not just that Donald Trump came into their state and tried to overturn the election result that they believe that they ran fairly, because they did run it fairly. But they're defending themselves, and they're defending themselves against this accusation. And it's very interesting that his co-partisans, these are Republicans, these are people who will vote for him if he is the Republican nominee, and they're more defensive than the paper of record. Now, of course, the Times has done great reporting on Trump, and they'll continue to do great reporting on Trump. But these sort of headline gaffes that you see from the Times, or the sort of overly credulous acceptance of Trump's framing that you'll see oftentimes from outlets like the Associated Press, it really should never happen.
Yeah.
And it never happens. The National Review, the Fox News, they never treat Democratic positions the way that New York Times treats entirely bad faith Republican positions, in particular in the case of Trump. I mean, he's innocent until proven guilty. But if someone applied to work for your radio show and they had a background check came back on them and it showed that they were under 4 separate federal indictments in 3 separate jurisdictions, facing 91 felony counts, not to mention their other criminal and civil misdemeanors in the past, including a jury in New York finding them liable for rape just a few months ago, you wouldn't hire that person. You wouldn't hire that person to
not only would I not hire him, Greg, I wouldn't let him in my door.
Yeah,
and yet you've got 35% of the country going, he's our guy, we're going down with the ship.
Yeah, I mean, if he's the Republican nominee, there are tens of millions of people who are going to vote for him, and there's an entire media apparatus and the sort of symbiotic political and media apparatus that is the right-wing echo chamber that will support him to the hilt and all the way through.
And what has that?
It's just no one else would ever be treated that way.
No, you're absolutely right. And, as you said, had Hillary had just a little bit of that kind of treatment, we'd be a different country. But how has the right apparatus handled this 4th indictment, 91 felony charges? How have they handled it?
This is actually somewhat fascinating. The severity of what Donald Trump stands accused of, and we can reiterate this, he's innocent until proven guilty in our system of justice. But the severity of what he stands accused of really is filtering into parts of the Republican base. We see that in Quinnipiac and Associated Press polling that has come out in the past, I think both of them were this morning or last night and today, where we saw that very substantial majorities of the public, including majorities of people who identified as Republicans, said that they would not vote for someone who had been convicted of a felony, and that they believed that being convicted of a felony should make you invalid as a candidate for the presidency. That was coming, I think it was 58% of Republicans in one poll said that if you were a convicted felon, you shouldn't be allowed to be president. Not just that they wouldn't vote for you, but that it should be banned. And so the severity of what he stands accused of, and the weight of the coverage, and the weight of the accusations and allegations, it really is filtering through. And next week, when we watch the Republicans debate for the first time, and it's not clear whether or not Donald Trump will actually attend that debate, but there are going to be, I believe, 4 people on that stage at the debate next week, because Mike Pence just qualified for the debate. There are going to be 4 people who, on that debate stage, who have said that Donald Trump was wrong, who've said up to that he committed crimes, or that they believe that he's guilty of the crimes he's accused of. And they're going to use that stage to take that case right into the Fox News echo chamber. They'll probably be booed. They'll probably spar with the hosts and the debate moderators. They'll probably be shut down by the other members on that stage who are there to defend Trump, like Vivek Ramaswamy, who's essentially just running a Trump campaign, more or less. But the right-wing media can't defend constantly against the barrage that Trump faces. Frankly, they're starting to give up under the weight of the pressure. We saw this earlier this afternoon. Guy Benson was being interviewed on Special Report on Bret Baier's program on Fox News, and he just seems sort of downtrodden. They're broken by this. They can't defend Trump because they know that he's guilty of a number of these instances. And so what they're doing is they are really redoubling their efforts to focus on pretend scandals affecting Joe Biden, almost all of which hinge on his son Hunter.
Yeah. Now, the breaking news today from the right media, since you brought that up, is that Trump said he's going to appoint a special counsel to investigate the Biden family and their corruption. So this is going to be, I guess, this is the re-election campaign. Re-elect me so I can go after Joe Biden. I mean, that seems to be all he's got at this point.
And of course, Trump did appoint this special counsel, the individual who was just elevated to the position of special counsel in the Hunter Biden investigation was a Trump appointee.
Yeah.
The U.S. Attorney for Delaware was appointed by Donald Trump specifically to investigate Joe Biden or Hunter Biden. And when President Joe Biden took the office, rather than firing that U.S. attorney, which is commonplace, you replace almost all U.S. attorneys. You let some finish up the work they're doing, and then you replace them with your own political appointees. This guy has been in that office for more than 3 years, entirely at the discretion of the White House. They have not touched that investigation. They have not interfered with it. They have allowed their appointed attorney general now to elevate that investigation to the level of special counsel. Joe Biden is just letting this witch hunt against his son go ahead. And Democrats are not defending Hunter Biden, who seems to be, he seems to be in some real stuff. Like, he was going through a really tough part of his life. But the things he stands accused of are pretty serious too. But they're nothing in comparison to Donald Trump. Hunter Biden is just a guy. He's a private citizen who seems to have made some serious mistakes in his personal life, and who has atoned for them how he could, legally and otherwise. But what the right-wing media wants you to do is they want to turn this into an email story, right? They want you to hear a cacophony of scandal when you think of Donald Trump. And you can't, it's just an amorphous scandal blob. You can't really attach anything to him. When you think about Joe Biden, they want you to think about Hunter, in the same way that when you thought about Hillary Clinton, you thought about emails. Yeah. And so with Trump, it was a million things, a myriad of things that you couldn't quite put your hand. You knew there was something iffy about him, but you didn't really know what it was because there were too many things to focus on. And what with Hillary Clinton, you could just say emails, and that's what happened in the media over and over again. And just as Trump's crime spree, it is affecting the GOP base. It is bleeding through, and it's filtering into their echo chamber. But at the same time, the right-wing media attempts to amplify Hunter Biden, to make him seem like, first of all, he's an important person at all, and also to make that scandal somehow stick to Joe Biden. Their efforts are working on the mainstream press. If you watch CNN, if you watch MSNBC, if you pick up a legacy newspaper every day, you'll see daily in the newspaper or hourly on mainstream cable news, you will see coverage of Hunter Biden. And right-wing media are working the refs, and they're complaining to the refs because it works. And so far they have successfully sort of tarnished Biden's presidency with a scandal that literally doesn't exist and is not part of his administration, but that he's been forced to answer for, and that he'll have to spend the next year answering for, because that's how the sort of both sides media works.
Yeah, no, it's crazy where we are. You're listening to the Rick Smith Show. We're with Craig Harrington. He's the research director over at Media Matters. You can check out their website, MediaMatters.org. We'll get links out on social media. I want to flip this around. Today's the anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act. President gave I thought was a good speech for him, talking about issues that speak volumes to me, and the need to reshore manufacturing and get into those places that have been forgotten. Any thoughts on the spiel today and the 1 year anniversary?
Yeah, it was actually as a theater critic, right? The media rollout for the White House's anniversary has actually been pretty robust. They've spent several days building up to this. They spent the last several weeks trying to land the Bidenomics message in the public media, and they've more or less had some success getting that picked up because they knew they were leading up to today and the anniversary of this big legislative package that they passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is very likely to be the last major legislation of President Biden's first term in office. And it's important to realize that on August 16th of 2022, so the day that the Inflation Reduction Act was signed by the president, and a couple of weeks after it had passed in the Congress, inflation was at 8.5%. Today, 1 year after the Inflation Reduction Act was signed and enacted into law, inflation is at 3.2%. And Democrats are trying to make that case. The White House is trying to make that case. Obviously, right-wing media refuse to acknowledge reality. If you watch Fox News, if you read any Trump-aligned outlets, or even the sort of DeSantis-aligned outlets like the National Review, they all claim that the economy is in a tailspin and that we might be on the verge of recession if we're not already in recession. They keep highlighting that inflation is out of control, even though it's not. And the mainstream media are struggling to tell this story because it's so easy to point to polling that shows high levels of economic anxiety. So when you ask individuals, particularly Republicans, in response to polls, how their economy is doing, how they're doing personally and financially, if their conditions have improved in the last year, they say, of course. And if you asked about the broader economy, this is particularly true of Republicans, but it's somewhat true of everyone else. They say that the whole economy is off track, but personally, they think they're
I'm doing great.
Everybody
else,
fine.
Everything else sucks.
Yeah,
no, because look, I struggle with this as well.
Bias.
I struggle with this as well, Craig, because look, I think Joe Biden is taking us in the right direction. Mm-hmm. I think we're moving away from neoliberalism and allowing corporations to go and move overseas. The idea that we're reshoring manufacturing, all that's great stuff. The fact that we're bringing back Davis Bacon protections so workers can enjoy better wages. All of this stuff is good stuff, but I still understand that people are struggling. That homelessness is on a rise. Credit card debt's on the rise. Mental health is problems are on the rise. Suicide rates are on the rise. We've got problems, but we've got to have solutions and a direction other than, well, it's all Joe Biden's fault. It's not, but it's something that has to be addressed.
As a very proud Ohio State Buckeye, it pains me to shout out University of Michigan professor Justin Wolfers, but he's an economist who is quite media savvy, and he's been making a point about this for many months, and he deserves attention for almost single-handedly trying to turn this narrative around in mainstream media, particularly on cable news. But for months, he's been going on television and talking about how all of the indicators we have show that the economy is on the right track and that things are improving. And the public still doesn't believe that that is true, in part because they're not being told that story by the media. You don't have the same number of stories about like how inflation has improved, or like how eggs are super affordable, or how milk is super affordable. Whereas a year ago or 18 months ago, CNN had that infamous Texas family that buys 12 gallons of milk a month, and they were suffering over $90 of increase in their monthly milk budget or things like that. That story got a ton of attention. You had the stories where journalists would go out and stand next to a gas station and point the camera at the price gauges and show you that, prices are out of control. But you can't do the opposite of that. You can't go to a gas station and point a camera at it and say like, well, look, gas is $3.68 and that's fine. And we're all comfortable with that. And part of it is that the media was so invested in inflation and in looming recession and in economic catastrophe because, if it bleeds, it leads. Yep. That's a good story. People were watching that.
Anger sells.
People don't want to be told. Yeah, absolutely. People don't want to be told that things are getting better. But then at the same time, there is a sort of sunk cost here, right? Like inflation has been dramatically improving steadily for a year. All of the trajectories show that it will likely steady and improve and maintain a baseline going into the future. All of the economists who were forecasting a recession in 2023 or in 2024, all of them have revised their data and are now arguing that a recession is unlikely. The Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank has a GDP forecaster that showed that they expected Q3 GDP to be 5.8% growth, which is like, those are China numbers. That is a shocking growth rate for an entire quarter in the economy. That is not a recession. And, Professor Wolfers during his appearances often jokes like, if we're in a recession, this is the worst recession ever. It's just not recessioning. But what people do remember is there is a legacy of these impacts, right? Like if you had wages growing at a rate that was below inflation for about 18 months, which was the case in the United States, you need to earn back sort of the area underneath that chart, right? The amount of wages that fell behind is a certain amount, and we haven't quite gained all that back. Now, the Biden administration is telling everyone that we will get right by 2024, that we're ahead of schedule and the economy is on the right track. And Democrats certainly believe that, at least a majority do. Independents are beginning to come around. But in public polling, Republicans just refuse to acknowledge that the economy is on the right track. And that's why you see these big numbers, these sort of stubborn numbers in public polls that keep getting covered by the Times and by CNN over and over and over again, where they say, well, the public says that the economy is still doing poorly. If you break down that polling, it's always the Republicans who refuse to accept that the economy has improved, or potentially they just represent a different demographic and it hasn't improved for them, though that's unlikely. They refuse to acknowledge that the economy has improved because their guy isn't in office. I guarantee you, if Donald Trump was the president today, Republicans would be saying that the economy was great, because they've been trained to sort of make this a partisan issue by their own media apparatus. And that's an area where the news coverage just hasn't caught up. Every time you see a poll about the state of the economy, that news article almost never breaks down the fact that if you break into crosstabs, you'll see independents are more or less split on the economy. Democrats think the economy is doing pretty well. And then 90% of Republicans tell you that the economy is doing poorly. And they're doing that because it's a political message for them. They refuse to accept that Joe Biden can do anything right. And it shows up in these stories that then have their own inertia.
Yeah. Now, for me, I look at what Biden's doing, and I love the fact that he's addressing the idea of wages on how they have to come up, and not just with rhetoric. I mean, I talked about the Davis-Bacon thing that they just came out with the last week sometime, saying, hey, we're going to go back to the original intent of the Davis-Bacon law to ensure that prevailing wages are paid to more workers, so that more workers have the opportunity to make better wage hours conditions, but also that the NLRB is moving backward towards the Joy Silk doctrine. That says, look, when you vote for a union, or when you sign a union card, you get the majority of people to sign up, you start negotiating. You don't go through 3, 4, 6 months of harassment and intimidation. This is a very pro-union move and a very pro-worker move, and something that I haven't seen virtually anywhere, except a couple of the places that I check. But this to me this, especially for union members, is a huge deal.
Yeah, I mean, we're in the midst of sort of union summer in the United States. It's one of the most prominent and influential and recognizable unions in the United States. The Screen Actors Guild is on strike in solidarity with their writers, who have been on strike and plan to continue striking for months. We saw prominent railroad strikes. We've seen strikes or threats of strikes and continued organization in the gig economy at major retailers. There's always a sort of looming unionization effort that you see from like big box retailers like Amazon. And you see this gaining steam because people have come to realize that the unions, that the labor movement broadly, and that unions in particular, offer them a real opportunity to get ahead through collective action. Media Matters has unionized, and when I was a member of the bargaining unit, I was very proud to help organize Media Matters. Several years ago. We were kind of the leading edge of the sort of union movement among younger workers, and now it's something that's bleeding out into all sectors of the economy and all industries, and it's a good thing for workers. And it's not an accident that this happens after the disruptions of COVID and after the economic turmoil that we saw over the past 3 years, because workers realized they needed to band together, and they're doing so, and they are realizing some of these gains that have been made available in this economic environment. And part of the reason that we're starting to see this kind of proper stabilization of things and wages really beginning to rise is because workers have power and they can make demands. Yep. And they're finally realizing that.
As soon as they realize that they actually have power, maybe things turn around. And as I've been saying, had we all had contracts that had cost of living adjustments in them, as my grandparents' generation had, maybe the inflation that we did suffer under wouldn't have been as painful. And again, this is another one of those things for me. But Craig, as always, I appreciate the time, the thoughts, the expertise, and the work that you guys do over at Media Matters. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to hear your thoughts. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. What are your thoughts? The economy doing well? Are things going in the right direction? How is your economy? That's what I want to hear. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Quick break, right back. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
From the steel mills of Pennsylvania to the auto factories of Michigan to the modern makers movement, manufacturing makes our nation great. I'm Scott Paul, president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. We bring business and labor together to advocate for policies that everyone can agree on. Together, we can strengthen manufacturing and create good-paying American jobs. Help us keep it made in America.
The good news is America is coming back. More jobs, more building, more of what makes our country great. And more cities and towns, more small businesses, and big corporations are choosing the highly skilled, highly trained members of the IBEW to do the work. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers is committed to doing the job right, on time, and safely. America is making a big comeback, and the IBEW is proud to do our part.
We are AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees. We represent 700,000 federal and D.C. government workers who are the vital threads of the fabric of American life. We support our nation's military. We take care of our nation's veterans. We protect our nation's borders. We respond to our nation's crises and natural disasters. We provide services to our nation's seniors. The American Federation of Government Employees. We work for America.
The old factory towns in America's heartland have been taking a beating. Thing is, though, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. The new CHIPS bill that got passed will bring jobs back home and has already resulted in big announcements of major new factories opening. The American Recovery Package has allowed cities and counties to hire new police officers and firefighters and start rebuilding their communities again. We're finally turning things around after 40 years of screwing over working people. But will we keep moving in the right direction? That's our choice.
Before we close the program, we want to take a moment to thank our viewers and to share a little bit about why we do what we do. At the Rick Smith Show, we believe that media today is almost entirely controlled by corporate greed. So we have now 24-hour news channels. But instead of 24 hours of news, what we get is 1 hour repeated 24 times, and with tons of commercials creating obscene amounts of profits. Information once presented as a public service has now become a private commodity. So when lies make money, lies are what we get. We get a corporate-controlled rage machine feeding us anger and hate, trying to convince us that our problems are right-left or red-blue, when they are and always have been up-down, the wealthiest 1% versus the rest of us. Our goal is to be an alternative to that machine, not as a news show with a fancy journalist out front, but as a talk show run by a union truck driver and a team of working-class heroes just like you. Everything we do, both what we get right and what we get wrong, is dedicated to advancing the interests of America's working families. No corporate ad buys, no think tanks, no focus groups, no talking points. We are media by working people, for working people. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you back here next time.